So this is part 2 of my commentary and reflection on the Proverbs, chapter 26. This chapter happens to be the chapter of the Fool, or the Fool's chapter, in the sense that, well, I'm not quite sure yet, but it seems like most of these verses mention the Fool in one way or another. And so we're going to continue that theme today. Last time I had left off with verse 6, and I'm going to continue now with verse 7. The legs of the lame are not equal, so is a parable in the mouth of a fool. So at this point, I think it's useful to remember that the Proverbs span quite a long distance. I've been using them thus far as a key to open a door for which my mind can explore. It opens up a landscape. It is a tool of mind for which we can expand our own understanding of the intelligible domain. And there are times in which a particular verse may seem simple on its surface. But however simple it may seem, I think we should not delude ourselves into thinking that its simplicity is to give us cause to think that we cannot come to a strong conclusion, a conclusion that would make us better and facilitate our spiritual growth. And as I approach this verse, it appears to me to be quite clear what this verse means. But it's only clear to me on the surface. I understand it as I understand looking at something for the first time. Just a glance. But of course, a glance is not enough to grow. For something to grow, it needs love, it needs attention, it needs time. The legs of the lame are not equal. Now, of course, this statement is meant to be false, for the legs of the lame are most certainly equal in the sense that their function is nil. There may be some ways in which the legs of the lame differ, but this is not the point. So is a parable in the mouth of fools. So where are we to go from here? How are we to utilize this key to open up some productive landscape? So first I want to talk about what a parable is. From my understanding, a parable is a story used to convey some moral teaching. Now I can imagine that this story can be either fictional or non-fictional. It still may transmit the intended information. But the question that I have in my mind is, in what way does the fool disrupt the distribution or the synthesis of that moral teaching within the story? Now, in the previous episode, especially near the end, I began to talk about the qualities that are associated with the fool that is found within man, but more specifically myself in my own experience. And I had used the symbolism of an old carpenter sitting at his workbench, not really knowing what to pay attention to, trying desperately to be of use, and yet all of his efforts seem to be unproductive. And his attention, which I value so highly, is spent being constantly eroded and degraded by some fruitless behavior or belief. And so first and foremost, if I sat down next to this fool and I asked him to tell me a parable, and let's say, for example, that it wasn't an option for him not to do it, that he would be forced to come up with something, my mind goes to the idea that this person, the foolish person, would not be able to orient his attention such that the story is coherent, or perhaps that the moral teaching makes any sense, or is in fact moral. Now, the question of why this might be the case, I suppose, doesn't matter all that much. I think the fact of the person's inability to attend and to synthesize and produce information is limited. Now, this verse goes a bit farther, and I think it gives us an extra quality of the fool that we ought to pay attention to. Now, regardless of the intention of the foolish person, considering two things that are equal, but then believing or saying that they are unequal, what we have here is a misidentification of that which is, a failure to recognize identities even if one is the same as another, and such a fundamental flaw in observing our reality would make it quite difficult to participate in that reality or to form strong relationships with others. For we can ask the question, what kind of identities would a person that has difficulties, or perhaps is unable to identify one identity, and then the elements of that identity that make it so, the characters of such a parable would, I think, be inconsistent, or at least their behavior would be inconsistent. The moral, the point of the story, would get lost in confusion and disorientation. For by moral, I mean that it is of a custom or a habit focused on that which is true. And by extension, we are considering those principles by which we orient our behavior, those principles that we believe to be true, that we believe to be orienting. And so a story, a narrative, the characters and the dialogue, everything is meant to illuminate that principle through the behavior of those characters. That perhaps in some way they become justified by the end of the story, or by their conduct or virtue throughout, or in a particular moment, they are deemed to be worthy of something, worthy of our praise, perhaps. And again, the fool, aside from having difficulties forming solid, consistent identities of things that he observes, but also within himself, the very idea of identifying something that is principled, something that ought to be unchanging, something that is true or that has led to some truth, this sort of thing requires strong attention. It requires a memory and a type of participation with information that the fool may not be concerned with. As he that bindeth a stone in a sling, so is he that gives honor to a fool. Now, much like verse 7, we are given this comparison situation. But instead of attributing to the fool this experience of being unable to identify things that share things in common or are functionally the same, we are now being asked to consider why it would be pointless to bind two stones within a sling, but also, once we have found that principle, we are to explore honor in the fool's hand and what that would look like. And so, to my mind, if I am to imagine that the sling that I am considering is an ancient weapon for hunting or for battle, whatever, in which there is a long axis around which it rotates around the hand which grasps the edge of the sling or the rope, and at the end there is this apparatus that holds a stone, and it is spun overhead quickly, and the stone is released from its sling, and it travels at high velocity to its target. But the problem about tying stones together is that it is unlikely that two stones would remain bound given such a force. And so it wouldn't make much sense to bind them. I suppose it's still possible to have two stones within one sling, but again, the binding of the two stones would be unreasonable. So just in this way, it would be unreasonable to bind honor to the fool, because of the force of the fool's behavior or being is such that once enacted into the world, that honor would be quickly ripped from its partner. But the key to this verse, I think, is to explore what that means. What it means to have honor, or just honor in general, and what it means to be artificially bound to something like honor, and then at the point when it actually matters, being torn from it. So to give somebody honor is to effectively give somebody respect, to give them high esteem, to praise certain qualities that they possess, to deem them to be virtuous, to potentially be emulated. To be virtuous is of somebody that is, or that has, high moral standards. And again, moral is something of a behavior, of a principle, for which one acts on. It is the root or the seed that their behavior, their action, their beliefs flow. So today is a new day. A new day brings new thoughts, new feelings. As I was going over that last bit of recording, my mind wandered over what this moral was. What this moral was that of the opinion of somebody that gives a fool honor may see within the fool. Now, I suppose it could be said that of the fool, with all of the unfortunate misgivings that that type of being may have, that it is not all for naught, that there may be parts of this foolish person that are indeed worthy of respect. But if we are to consider a person to be foolish, we are to consider the fundamental elements, the principles that make up the being of that person, are fundamentally oriented in the direction of foolishness. Foolishness, again, something that I have described as the inability to form an adequate map or projection of identities. And I think that extends to the ability to solve problems effectively and make coherent arguments, generally to make sense. Now, this moral or principle, an honorable person, a virtuous person, is said to have high moral virtue. Now, high is an interesting word to use, for it means that it is above something else. Above something else in what way? Well, we would say in terms of goodness. In terms of goodness, we would say in terms of truth. In terms of truth, we would say that which is correct, that which is right, given the context. And this truth is often, I think, difficult to see, much more difficult to see by the observations of the foolish person. For again, their fundamental principles, whether they are aware or not, do not fit, they are not congruent with, that of a virtuous person. That of a person who can consistently and reliably identify identities or identity that is within themselves or in the environment or among the various relationships that identities have with other identities. It could be said that it would be a foolish thing that if I took my remote that is in front of me and I pressed the change the channel button to flip a page of the Bible. In a similar manner, it would be strange if I flipped a page in the Bible and expected my television to change the channel. There needs to be a correct identification of identity and of purposes in order to interact effectively in the world, whether it be with objects or other agents. In this case, I mean other people. Now, if we were to formally extend this out a little bit, we took the example of the misuse and the misidentification of the remote control, attributing to it some function that is other than that which it possesses, some purpose that it cannot fulfill. And we extend and also imagine that if I were to take honor, again in the formal sense, and place it within the basin of this analogy, and observe what reaction would take place, I think what would become immediately apparent is that this gift of honor, this giving of honor, of attempting to see something that is false in a place that is high, in a place that is good, in a place that I attribute heavy meaning, would undoubtedly cause me to become foolish. It would undoubtedly cause me to value the fact that the principle that had led to the mistake of this observation, this reasoning, whatever, is actually the thing that I wish to incorporate within my being. But of course, this is only from my point of view. This has nothing to say about the relationship that honor has to the foolish person. As we are thinking about the sling now that the foolish person is wound up within this strange and unholy relationship with that of honor. In the formal sense, when I think about honor, I think about true virtue. I think about true esteem, true respect. And for this point of view, it's beyond my sight to see exactly what the truth of these sorts of things are in their totality. There's only one being that can do so. But I can imagine that being being able to do such a thing. And since that being is able to do such a thing, it is the cause. Maybe we could say that the cause is actually the being's participation, but also it would seem that there's a strong relationship between the way in which the being sees. I'm talking about God, of course, the transcendent being, the divine logos. About that which that being sees, and also the ability of our minds to imagine something, or imagine a concept such as honor, as wide-ranging as it may be, actually having some truth independent of the person that gives it, or the person that is on the receiving end of it. And so by this formal sense of true honor, it would not be possible for something that is true to be bound to something that which is false, something of that which is false. And one must ask the question, well, why is this the case? Surely they are opposites, and they are wed together in that sense. But that which is false seems to be a check on that which is true, or that which is. For I could say many things about the dime that I hold in my hand. Many of those things would be incorrect. I can say of this dime that it is a liquid, but that is false. But it is not false because the liquid nature of this dime does not agree with me. It is because there is no liquid nature of this dime. The dime is in fact a solid. I suppose there's a way in which we can turn this into a liquid, but that is beyond the purpose of the analogy. So then there is another question that is raised. Is that which is false nothing but perceptual output on the part of some agent? I'm not sure that I can answer that question, but I will say that of one agent, and of many agents, of agents that are beneath the supreme agent, again the divine logos, that is able to see and understand all perspectives simultaneously, I think the ability to process information, to identify everything about something, and how it relates to something else. It would not be possible to get all of these things correct. We are not beings that can analyze perspective in totality. But despite only examining a fraction of something at any given time, we may understand a quite detailed map. But as I see this dime, I am, perhaps in some sense, severely disappointed that I cannot see both sides of the coin at once, no matter how hard I try to do it. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't understand what is on one side and then the other side. I could take a picture of the dime, and I could look at both sides while I am participating in observing the physical dime. But of the object itself, I will never be able to see both sides. It is just an inherent limitation that is placed on my level of conscious experience. Now, just because I lack the immediate ability to perceive all perspectives of a particular object, of an idea, of that of reality, it doesn't mean that I can't come to some solid understanding of what is. I'll have to take more of a segmented step 2 approach rather than an all-encompassing one, which is perhaps an ability that is well beyond my capacity as a human being. Now, I say all of that because there's a certain way in which I think the mind can find or use the definition of the fool that I have been putting forth, and say that we're all foolish to a degree. And I think that that is true. I think we all have that little fool that rests inside of us. And as I've mentioned already in this podcast, or perhaps a podcast episode prior, that this fool, although if he encompasses large aspects of our principled nature, will cause our identity to be foolish, our behavior to be foolish. But if he occupies that small segmental portion of our experience, for which the fool is more of a gesture than that of somebody who perpetually disrupts identity, formation and identification, then the fool is in his proper place. Which, in his proper place, would be the expression, the elimination, or the disruption of some belief, some structure, some idea that was created within the mind, that was given a principled position in the formation of our identity, but is actually based on a falsehood. In this sort of situation, having the fool present to break this up and to make the broader conscious experience aware of how foolish we have been by sort of exercising foolishness ourselves. And I use this word exercising extreme caution here, because in the broader context, perhaps we wouldn't consider it to be exercising foolishness, but rather some keen ability to break down and to identify. But if we just have that ability to break down, rather I should say to break down and to lose the ability to identify, then we run into trouble. So I'd like to tie up this verse, but I'd like to mention a few important highlights that we've gone through so far. The fool is a person that I think fundamentally is poor at allocating attention. They are poor at recognizing patterns that would form some representation, perceptual mapping of a thing, of something, person, idea, object, whatever. And by extension of this, I have said that they are poor agents at identity recognition, but also formation. They can be quite destructive individuals. I also made the point that of the whole of an agent, if this is to be a fool, we are to expect the type of agent that their behavior may result in something that we would expect from a wicked person or an evil person. This is the destruction of something that is good. I also mentioned that within every one of us, within every one of our hearts, rests a foolish tendency. The foolish tendency or leaning, I think given proper constraints, most likely would not be called a fool because of the place that they actually occupy. It's like making the distinction between a king and a manager of a company. Both may be in positions of authority, but the types of power that they wield is totally different. But there are qualities that are the same, like leading and managing certain things. I see the fool and the aspect of the fool in this way. Now, we also mentioned that the concept of honor and the moral principles by which one would be granted honor are inconsistent with an individual that is unable to identify that which is true in any meaningful way. And so because of this, much like the stone in a sling that is ripped apart if it is bound superficially to another, honor and the fool cannot coexist. They are contradictions. As the thorn goes up into the hand of a drunkard, so is the parable in the mouth of fools. And so here we go again. Chapter 26, the chapter of fools. So beginning with the first half of this verse, as the thorn goes up into the hand of a drunkard. So we could perfectly imagine well a drunkard in our minds. And for whatever situation, whatever context, it doesn't have to be malicious, it could be purely accidental. But the fact that we find, that the drunkard finds, a thorn within his hand, I would have to imagine if he is sufficiently inebriated, the feeling would probably be dulled quite a bit. Secondly, his care of that penetration into his flesh would be minimal. That he would be so absorbed within that state of inebriation that the mind probably would not allocate appropriate meaning to the situation. It's like a substance that perpetuates the foolish mind. I'm sure many of us have had this experience before of being a little too intoxicated. And there's a certain point at which the mind just really doesn't value things as it should. It doesn't identify patterns in meaningful ways that we can interact properly with our environment. There's a common understanding in our culture, even if we haven't experienced this sort of thing, of a blackout drunk experience in which a person can be completely conscious and interacting with the world, and yet the day after they will not remember anything of their experience because they were so inebriated that the machine, the mind, the capacity to understand the world and to experience it, the overarching identity that was responsible for controlling that ship was absent. Quite a foolish thing. Self-induced foolishness. Now there's another way in which we can see this that's somewhat related, but more literal in its translation or interpretation. If we remove a layer of this, so we take the image of a thorn, and we ask ourselves, what are some of the qualities of this thorn? Well, there's a large base which narrows to a point. This point is considered by us to be sharp, and it's something that we consider before we go and reach for it, because the potential is that it would cause us pain if we grabbed it in the wrong way, so there must be a tension there. But then it says, this thorn is going up. And if we think of the word up, often ascending is seen as a positive thing. It is seen as a good thing. It is seen as moving towards God or towards the heavenly domain. Now, if the hand is at some place between the traveling of this thorn, this broad-based, narrow-peaked object, as it moves upward, it encounters the hand like it's an obstacle to its path. In this way, we can imagine it would be quite foolish for a person not to be aware of the trajectory of this thorn, or the position of this thorn, or the constitution of the thorn, again, that it is a broad-based, narrow-peaked structure. And so what we have is, what can be said is that there is a relationship here between something that represents a positive trajectory or path is piercing the very aspect of ourselves that affords us action in the world. Our hands are these massively unique physical structures that can manipulate things based on our perceptions and our wills, our desires. And so there's a way in which one can read truth can pierce through an unsuspecting agent. If the agent is not paying attention, has poor self-awareness, or is inebriated in this situation. And the interesting thing is that I think that this interpretation is appropriate because the second half of the verse, so is a parable in the mouth of fools. The parable is something that is comparable to the thorn, whereas before the thorn was this, potentially at least, can be thought of as this object that is arbitrary, that is there just to make some point about the inattentiveness of the drunkard. But in fact, looking more into it, and hopefully not looking too far into it, the thorn, and accompanied with the word up, is a further representation for not just an arbitrary object that pierces an unaware person, but rather something that has structure, it has meaning, that it is going somewhere, it is pointing to some truth, up to some goodness. Just as a parable is a story that points us to some broader and more profound moral truth. In the mouth of the fool, that organ by which every individual uses to communicate and to spread information, it is the currency of our minds, that this structure is now penetrated by truth. But this truth is something that is unappreciated by the foolish person. They are unable to conceptualize of this object of mind, and that the moral, perhaps, goes over their heads, in the sense that they are not able to synthesize and interpret appropriately the information. So the moral is lost on them. And in fact, the moral, much like the thorn, damages the person. Instead of damaging the unaware drunkard's hand, it penetrates and damages the mouth, the transmission piece of information of that agent, which brings back to mind an earlier verse, verse 6, "He that sends a message by the hand of a fool cuts off the feet and drinks damage." It would seem perhaps to some, or an aspect of my mind that wishes to appeal to this situation, that it would seem a bit odd that a moral or some truth would have such a damaging effect to an individual made in God's image, that has a degree of autonomy, agency, has independent thoughts, that can be said of their experience that they are a conscious, self-aware agent. And it would seem that in a perfect world, truth and goodness, rather than harm or destroy, would be something that binds and connects. And I suppose that this is one of the aspects, this is one of the functions. But what we can't ignore is the potential for the human being to get wound up within a form of identity, of self, that the very encounter with truth, in the context of their experience, their being corrupted by this foolishness, it is sufficient for that truth, unfortunately, to penetrate them, to damage them, because the self is unable to recognize that the damage that is being done to them is actually occurring. Again, what comes to mind is the drunkard that puts his hand over the thorn. But of course, what appears to be this cruel nature is really not outside of the possibility of the foolish agent to come to recognize the truth of what it is, to transcend their own mistakes, to reform a new identity, to be born again, as we would call it. The great God that formed all things both rewardeth the fool and rewards transgressors. This is a perfect follow-up verse. So today is a new day, and I would like to take this time to talk about why I think that this verse is the perfect follow-up to the verse prior. And it's not just the previous verse that makes this an interesting follow-up, it's the series of verses that were before. And as I've mentioned, all of these verses mention the fool. This is our thematic overlay for this chapter so far. And the image that is unfolding it's fascinating. It's a beautiful image. It's bizarre in some way. This idea that within the heart of every man that there is this fool or a foolish tendency that exists. This dovetails with previous imagery of that of the outside being integrated at the center of something. So for example, thinking about an old ancient city that's surrounded by walls. The walls are there for a purpose, to delineate, to make explicit where the city limits are and where the suburban or rural environments begin, where there might be farmland or the wild, who knows. And within the city, we have the character, we have the identity of that thing. And as much as we try to keep the wild forces at bay by building our walls and keeping our institutions within those walls, inevitably there is the unfortunate fallen symptom of man, maybe we can say, that finds itself deep within that city. And maybe it's too harsh to say it's the fallen symptom of man, but there will always be this otherness, the wild that has found itself within the barrier, within the identity for which we try to exclude, the wilderness and the unstable, the chaotic. Now, of course, the chaotic, the unstable, all of this does not take up the core, the principle of the identity of the city or of the people, but it takes up an aspect. And much like the fool, I have to wonder if there is not a utility involved with this wilderness, this chaos. And again, it's a matter of perspective, or maybe I should say, more specifically, it's a matter of context, because it's easy to get lost in saying, well, this is a necessary component, this is something that we should value, that we should prop up. In my view, as I am coming to understand this sort of thing, it seems like, much like we may purify water with some otherwise poisonous substance, we dilute this substance so that it is hardly traceable, and that its effect on the human body is nil, and yet the effect within the system is such that it eliminates bacteria. This is something that is a positive. And although there may be some secondary consequences, the trade-off, the decision has been made to accept this substance within us that in high doses would be toxic, but in low doses is safe for consumption. And I feel this way about the foolish. I feel this way about that chaotic thing that I had mentioned, the chaotic principle, the unknown, the unstable. all of this in their proper diluted state will provide us with some positive externality. Now, with this in mind, with this image in mind, and there's much more, of course, than just that, but that is something that immediately comes up from what I remember from days previous. But taking everything, and then wondering why it is the case that the great God that formed all things both rewards the fool and rewards transgressors. What can this possibly mean? How can we find ourselves within this landscape, within the mind, to draw the map, to see ourselves in some way of understanding what this might mean? The perfect follow-up to the verses that I had just mentioned involves wondering about the place of foolishness, the place of things that we would otherwise find unsavory and wish not to have such things close to us or in high dose, because we know the damaging effects of them. And a reward such a precious thing. In what context can we imagine a reward going to such a person as a fool or a transgressor? So let's start with the first half of the verse. I have a feeling that this one might take a while. And part of the reason that I think that it's going to take some time is that what I would like to explore is the great God. Now, every so often we are prompted with words like Lord, God, and it's up to the reader whether or not he or she wishes to explore that domain. And I've been using the Proverbs as a tool, as a key to open that door to the mind, where there is, once the door is open, what is revealed is a broader, intelligible landscape that one can play in, that one can create in, anything that we wish to do, really. So the great God that formed all things, we're going to begin there. So how does one even begin to conceptualize of the great God, let alone the being that formed all things? So I'd like to try something a little bit different. Usually what I do is I'll look up an etymological chain, or I'll start with a standard definition. I think that there are certain benefits to that approach for interpretation. It gives a solid foundation of the meaning of words, and then one can expand outward and upward from there. But there's also the possibility of the more of the intuitive approach and understanding. Some of that, a lot of that, involves experience, personal experience. And now I firmly believe that the Bible is a way to access the truth through one's own experience. Unlike the modern day and the scientific enterprise, the self is removed from the observation of things. Maybe not totally, but at least in terms of the procedure, the self is removed. And there's good reason for that, to remove potential confounds and deceptive results, or the deceptive interpretation of results. But despite good reason, there's always a sacrifice. And I think that which we lose for the guarantee of security of information, or our belief in the security of information, is that we lose the human, soulful component of our experience and observations. Now, I don't want to harp on the scientific process too much, because I think it's an excellent tool, much like I think the Proverbs are an excellent tool. But since we are in this domain, I think it's appropriate to make that distinction. So in my hand, I hold this key. Perhaps it can be heard through the microphone. This key will now serve as a symbol for the proverb that we are exploring now. And I would like one to imagine that I've put the key into the door, I have unlocked the door, and I've opened it. The first thing that we encounter is something that is great. And the first question, of course, is, well, there's probably some intuitive understanding on the part of the individual, and since I am the one that's opening this door, I stand in front of it. And so my interpretation, my view of this thing, if it is to be immediately attributed, or if I can say, that the terms that I immediately attribute to this thing that I see is great, I want to know what I myself mean by that thing that I see is great. Now, of course, in this situation, when I see a physical object, there are plenty of characteristics that appear to me. The characteristics and my interpretation of these characteristics do not necessarily need to take me on this journey of wondering exactly how to project something into the space, because I am appropriately designed to imagine and to project the object that actually is in this space. Now, since I am in the position where I lack what I might call a direct relationship, and there's probably inconsistencies with the language that I'm going to be using here, but bear with me for a moment. When I mean direct relationship, I hold another object in front of me here. This is a glass bottle. It's labeled crystal on it, and it has some interesting crystals inside of it. And one can hear it as I shake it in front of the microphone. If only I could do the same for God. If only I can grasp Him as I can grasp an object, or see Him as I can see this object. Then I could provide so many characteristics that in this situation come so naturally to me. But this is the exploration that I think is important here, because as a matter of faith, we go off of reason. In some sense, I go off of faith that this object that I hold is actually something that exists. And that brings a new question to the fray of what exactly is meant by faith. And if it is to be the situation where, by both situations, that we call the faith in a physical object of its existence, but also something that is unseen and unfelt, or maybe not unfelt, but unseen in the physical sense, then how are we to justify the two together? Because there's an obvious difference between the two. That is the absence of tactile input, the absence of visual input. I suppose there are ways that we can come around to this, come full circle, which we may in the future, but I'm curious at this point about justifying the potential discrepancy of these faiths. And also I'd like to point out that another reason that we are attempting to justify the discrepancy is by, as I've just said, it's by the information that we receive. Now, in terms of my faith for this bottle of crystal, the question that I must pose to myself is, well, what are the qualities, what are the pieces of information that make you say that this thing is something, that this is not just a figment of your imagination, that it is an actual object that exists in reality? And I would say that I can tell by the tactile input, I can tell by the visual input, I can tell by the sound that it makes when I interact it with other objects. I suppose I can test it against various natural forces that I understand, that I interact with every day, gravity being one, motion, all of this sort of thing. I can put it to the test, and I can reliably come to the conclusion that this thing is something that I can depend, if I leave it in one place, assuming that the place is stable, that it would not move the object, that when I come back and I return, that object will be there. And it's because of this dependency and consistency of information, incoming information, that I believe that this object is to exist. Now, I don't mean that to... Now, I don't say all of that to say that that's an exhaustive list of proofs for how this thing can be said to exist. But it is just some. But there's a broader point that I would like to make here. And part of this point has to do with the term great, which is the principle of our exploration at this time. Now, within my exploration of my faith into this bottle of crystal, there was at no time that I really made comparisons, except in the sense that I had mentioned that I can tap it against various surfaces to see how it interacts. I could place it within substances, whatever. But I didn't say anything about its position relative to other things. And I had said nothing about its purpose. I think these types of distinctions open up another entire domain of observation. Now, I have the desire to say that if I say that this bottle is not great, then it is a term of comparison. That I am only really saying that this bottle is not great because there is something that I know otherwise of greatness in which this bottle does not fill that mold or fill that void. And despite my current inability to come to a solid definition of what the word great means, I retain this intuitive sense that this object is not and cannot be considered something that is great, which I find strange. But at the same time, there are many things that are strange about our experience, our existence. There are things about the body that I do not understand. How exactly it is that when I place my hand to the surface of something, that I can understand the temperature. I can intuitively figure whether or not it is safe for me to touch. There are other times in which, if I place my hand over a hot metal stove, reflexively, much beneath my reason, I will recoil to protect myself. There are within the human body, there are processes that run as a part of the entire system, the agentic system, but rest beneath the immediate or the explicit awareness of how they actually work. And for an organism, for, again, an agent to be aware of such a thing, I think is fascinating. But I say that because this domain of intuition implies that there are ways in which an organism can understand the world without necessarily understanding it to the degree that the scientific enterprise has gifted us. The type of determined understanding. And I think even determined understanding is a bit of a stretch or a reach, because even if I explain the degree of the various receptors that are within the hand that allow me to interpret what temperature an object is or feel it in general, and how that information is passed on through the nerves up into the brain and how that's integrated into some understanding of the environment, this is merely an agent understanding a process that is. But more importantly, I would say that of my understanding of my own self, I attribute some moreness to its own perceptions, to its own existence. That the strangeness that I find within the automaticity of its experience and the lack of understanding in the sense of, maybe in the scientific sense, but also the concrete understanding of personal experience, makes me think of a system that is somewhat determined, much like a car that is built for a purpose. Now, the car is not self-aware, but it has components of purposeful design, that there is a reason that undergirds its existence, and that its interaction of the environment is to fulfill certain purposes. And despite the car's awareness of its exact function, what operates on top of it is some higher level or some higher order agent that uses it to direct its purposes. Now, it's possible that part of man's experience is, in this situation, that he lives to have on top of his conscious experience the projection of heavenly sources, that he is a material creature, but endowed with the ability to access that immaterial domain. And so he is this interesting form for which some conscious experience can be molded. So now, of these distinctions that I spoke of, that are a bit different than just the material observations, but things that seem to extend out into this Aristotelian formal landscape. For in this landscape we talk about purpose, we talk about meaning, we talk about consciousness, we talk about comparisons of something that is larger or smaller. We talk of things that are great and of things that are poor. These concepts seemingly don't have, with the exception perhaps of large and small, really don't have a physical underpinning. We can trace some rooted physical underpinning to that of consciousness, but if we speak of consciousness and we speak of the subjective experience of consciousness, the language that we use is really not within the physical framework. So let me return to the image of the key that has opened the door, and the first thing that we are confronted by is greatness. How exactly do I see this? How exactly does one see this? I had started out by saying that or at least asking the question, how would I know if something before me was great? And that spurred that broader, somewhat fruitless conversation, or perhaps not, of understanding things in general, of knowing something. So we encounter this greatness. Greatness can come in many forms, I would imagine. In my mind, since I'm thinking about a being, I'm trying to give it physical form, but I think I should resist the urge to do so. I can imagine a physical object, surely. A physical object that is great. I think about a great work of art. That is intricate sculptures. I think about famous Italian art. In my mind, what makes this great, at least the image, is that it is richly symbolic, that it is intricate, it is detailed. It is something representative of a larger concept. Maybe it represents a condition. When I think of a man that is great, it could be his size that is great, but often great men are referred to by their deeds rather than their physical features. At least in any sense when we compare it to the expanse of time as we move farther into the future and away from a man's life that was lived. What is remembered is more of his behavior, his actions, rather than his stature, physical stature. And so I wonder about this characterization of a person's legacy. When we say somebody was great, like Alexander the Great, we remember their deeds. We remember significant things about the things they had thought. We think about Christ, we think about Socrates. And much like this illustration or the example that I had mentioned earlier about our physical perception, I think of touch, I think of sight, smell, auditory. Out of these, I think we can add another. It's a peculiar one. It's one that seems to exist when I try to consider my own deeds, the deeds of others, the deeds of those great men that I had mentioned. The question arises, well, what exactly is it about the deeds that we find valuable or meaningful? Of course, there are plenty of things that we can go off of here to make some example of that, some parable, some battle that was won, some display of virtue or honor. But regardless of what it might be, and regardless of some universal consensus about a particular action or behavior that ought to be admired, what I come down to is the moral, the principle, the meaning, and the value. And it seems that the mind has this way of understanding that which is valuable, much like it has a way of understanding what something smells like, that we can differentiate the smell of food from something that is not food, some of which is learned, some of that seems to be hardwired and innate. And of that process that seems to be hardwired and innate, the process of understanding that which is valuable, I think, is inherent in man. Now, of course, this understanding of that which is right and that which is wrong is complex. It is very sophisticated, and often he is wrong about the things that are really right and the things that are really wrong, especially in hindsight. There are many historical examples of this. But nonetheless, there is this sense in which man can identify patterns of behavior in other human beings, but also the natural world, that seem to display meaning. So the question is, well, why does he have these senses? Of the sense of taste and of vision and of smell, why does he have them? Why does he have the ability to appreciate art and that which is valuable? The cynic would say that he has these sensations because of an evolved sense that he has adapted to his environment, and because he has been so successful within his niche that he has evolved extra sensory capacities. But putting aside the evolutionary trap for which we would go back around and try to find various environmental justifications for a particular behavior or a particular trait, I think it's useful to look at the whole of the experience, the entire trend, that what is life actually moving towards? What does it come from? What does it exist in? I come back to this sense of greatness. If we allow ourselves for a moment to go back to the image of us standing at the open doorway, that we see something that is great and we understand ourselves to have the ability to pick up on this thing that is great. And yet it is not a person that stands before us necessarily. I suppose it's not an object. It's not something that we can see. It's not something that we can smell. It's not something that we can touch or hear. But it is something that we do perceive. It is something of a memory that is brought back to us, a fond memory, a memory of love. Now perhaps I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, and that I'm considering God more so than I am just the term great. But I think there's a little bit more work to be done here in terms of justifying our faith, or in terms of understanding that which is beyond many of our traditional senses for which we can understand what's in front of us. I heard this explanation by Robert Kennedy earlier this morning when he was talking on a podcast, and of his experience with faith and of his belief in God. His initial experience with it was fake it till you make it. And like with many things, it's interestingly true. I find that in my own professional life, there is an aspect of fake it till you make it, especially when one is younger in the profession. It takes time to learn. It takes time to understand exactly what you know and how to apply what you know. And more importantly, to integrate that which you know into some meaningful solution to problems, effective solution to problems. Now, Robert Kennedy's point is not necessarily that we should fake it because it's not true, but rather, given the lack of the ability to perceive, the strong ability to perceive, at least from our perspective, from my perspective, the strong ability to perceive is quite grounded within the material, within the physical world. I am a physical agent, after all. But what I think is meant by this fake it till you make it situation is that we are assuming the pretext to our behaviors assumes that there is an order, that there is a creator, that there is a justifier that knows and understands, that is responsible for the propagation of identity and the relatedness between those identities. There is one singular identity that we can trace back all of intelligible experience to, and that's something that is God. So, here we are, in the doorway. Perhaps we've taken one step in the doorway. But as we move into this place, what we are moving into is greater understanding of what it necessarily means by the term the great God. I mentioned that we've taken a step, but we still have a lot to go, especially in terms of some of the other proverbs that we've explored. The key readily opens the door. We are able to run quickly into the field and frolic and play, but this one is seemingly much more difficult. Of our traditional experiences, it's hard to relate things to such a heavenly or high identity compared to our own. But if we are to be agents that are truly made in the image of God, then there are aspects of our own experience that we can relate to and find our way back home, in a sense. Home, in this situation, towards greatness. Greatness of being, greatness of understanding, greatness of wisdom, greatness of knowing. All three of those terms certainly related, but are also used independently in the Proverbs. Now, I think that there is something about being, about the way to be, that causes man to experience life in a particular way. Now, I would hope that that would be something that is quite obvious. We've been talking a lot of the fool, and that, of course, is a particular way of being. It's a way of being, as I've mentioned, disrupts or causes difficulty with understanding and interpreting identities, patterns, finding meaning within the environment, within one's life. The experience of that sort of man would be diminished. They might turn inward because the only thing that they can grasp is their own feelings and desires. Moreover from that, within the understanding that our feelings and desires are actually extremely important components to our being, I think an add-on to that previous statement would be that these feelings and desires for the foolish person are not sophisticated. They are left within. They are left within the insular. They are the only form of identity that they feel the inattentive mind can actually hold on to. And this is short, temporary bursts of attention and of grasping meaningful experience. And of course, if we are relegated to that sort of experience, we miss a whole range of potential emotions associated with much larger periods of attention and focus. Now, I want to say here before I continue that we must recognize that within us we all have a foolish disposition. It's just a matter of where that fool is placed, what he is restricted to. In my view, I think it would seem that what can be considered great, or at least my own perception of how I would honestly justify to myself witnessing a great person, would be a person that is able to maintain attention, to have such a strong sense of discipline and of drive that they achieve things, that they experience things beyond my current ability, that inspires me to be better. Now, this betterness, I think, is the key word. There's a way in which our culture has fallen into a particular type of trap. I think it's a type of defining that which is better, that relegates betterness towards certain things. And although we can be better in certain domains, it would seem that the domains that we are restricted to cause us to be foolish in a way. And what I mean by that is the domains that we are restricted to is greed, it is material possession, it is instant gratification, it is hard work for the sake of rising in the ranks of some organization or institution for which the ranks really are not all that meaningful, and that they just sort of propagate that greedy behavior. In essence, it's foolishness. It's that short-term attention for that short-term satisfaction. And it doesn't extend into our posterity. It doesn't extend down to the depths of our soul. It just gratifies the immediate senses. So moving forward, back to this idea of greatness, and eventually to the great God, I think what we are trying to get to is the expansion of the various pursuits, the expansion of the domains, the ordering of our meaningful labor, our meaningful experiences, what we receive remuneration from, the purpose for which our time is offered. It would seem that even among the superficial senses there is a place. There's a place for all things. There's a place even for the fool within our hearts. For the very verse that we are discussing, the great God that formed all things both rewards the fool and rewards transgressors. There's a way in which these things are integrated into our experience, but it may not be the way in which we would expect it to be. And if it is a way, for example, in the contemporary age, where our experience of things, our participation with our institutions, with each other, becomes watered down, becomes superficial, there's a way in which the reward actually diminishes us as human beings, as species, or rather our pursuit of the reward. Now, I don't think that this is the meaning of this verse. I think there's a much deeper meaning, which we will get to in time, but again, we're still focusing on the great God. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the expansion of what we understand to be valuable, or at least the volume for which we can fill our pursuits with actual and true meaning, I think the greater that we will be connected with each other, the better our posterity will be in the long term, and the greater that our experience will be, the greater our experience will be. For we haven't lost the part of ourselves for something that is superficial. We've recognized that there is more depth to mind and to experience than that which we pursue. Now, of course, it's not completely this way in our society or in our culture. There's plenty of goodness to be had. And it's not as though that every institution and every person is greedy. And even within the most greedy of institutions and of people, I think that there is the expansionist, the divinity that lies within the heart, much like the fool rests within the heart of every man. This sort of thing is, in a general sense, a matter of context and of proportion. Now, what I'm prompted to consider about at this point is the way in which my own experience has dovetailed, maybe not dovetailed, but has waved sort of in and out like a sine wave of the foolish experience and that of something of more of a disciplined, of something that is on the path to greatness, on the path to God. And I found a few things, I think, that are always consistent. And that it is within this constancy that my faith begins to unfold and to develop. The first thing that comes to mind is practices. Practices that require sacrifice. Practices that require sustained attention. This being one of them. Another one being exercise. Another one being my occupation. Another one being my relationships. But all of these sorts of things I found cannot be passive. I have to be actively involved. I have to be putting in effort. I have to be paying attention. Otherwise, I'll only be participating on a foolish level, foolish participation. And despite my efforts, there are times that I find myself either seemingly incapable of gathering the courage to fulfill some practice, or that I am just so exhausted from the day, from life in general, that it's difficult to participate in the experience. And there's always this temptation to inflate the ego of the fool so I can satisfy more superficial ends, so that the fool can take over my attention, and by taking over my attention, disrupt it so I'm not really paying attention to anything that is actually valuable. And within this experience, I think that I can recognize that when I am not giving into the fool, that when I do make the sacrifice towards God, towards greatness, that my overall experience, although it may be at the expense of my immediate, my overall experience is much greater than sacrificing the expansive or the long term for the short term. And I think it's by this reason that I have faith. that there is this order for which I can follow, that I can keep the fool at bay. But again, there are often situations where I fail, and I think it's a part of the faithful person to get back up and to keep on trying. If there is a full surrender to the foolish disposition, our minds will find itself in a fog, perhaps within addiction, within superficial relationships. And overall, life and its experience would be dull. It would be flat, placid. But within that placidity, I think there is the temptation, as I've just mentioned, about having something, an experience that is calm, for which we are unbothered. But again, it's about everything in its proper place. The great God that formed all things both rewards the fool. So, within this domain, now there is this conception of what the great God is. It's something that we can experience. It's not something that we can directly communicate with, at least not immediately. But it is something that we can come into contact with by virtue of our own will. So now let's move on. The great God that formed all things. So I'd like to continue this exploration and to outline the map that this affords us, the map of mind that this affords us. So let's begin with this word form. When I think about the word form in this context, I think of a creative element. I think of the word constituted, or to make up, to form of different components. There is a sense of emergence in this, but also a sense of top-down creation of the elements, and then the convergence of those elements to create differing things, different identities. So today happens to be a new day, and I figured I'd take some time to get my mind back into the Proverbs. And there's been something on my mind lately, and it's hard to describe exactly what it is. I suppose it's a combination of a few different factors. But perhaps I'll start by saying that in my experience in life, I find my mind to get itself into what I might call a rut every once in a while. It's a perspectival rut, that it seems that I get too caught up into my own worries, dread, perhaps foolishness, inattentiveness, and I lose focus on that which brings me towards the divine, it brings me towards God. There are times when over-intellectualization may cause it. There are times when intellectualization may remedy it. It's a bizarre sort of thing, almost like I'm chasing this dark figure to and fro in my mind, in my experiences, always playing whack-a-mole with this thing, sometimes hitting it, sometimes not. There is also the cultural position that we are in, the cultural moment, maybe I could say, that we are in, and of the many voices that are online that constantly influence my decisions, perhaps my opinions, my thoughts on certain things. And sometimes the amount of information that comes in is just too much. And I think that there are times that I undergo a period of overload, that I'm running on red, that my mind doesn't have time to reorient and to consider that divine principle for which I'm trying to orient myself, my life, myself, around. And in moments like this, if my words find anyone, I would like them to wrap themselves around you as they are wrapping themselves around myself at this moment, to remind myself and you to take a moment, no matter how painful the moment of silence may be. Sit until it is no longer painful. Challenge yourself to the experience of your own thoughts. And until you can manage them, and until you achieve some productive state of mind, you may resume normal activities, daily activities, whatever. Now, it's easier for me in this sort of situation because I'm speaking about it. I'm taking the time right now. I am in my quiet place, even though I'm speaking aloud. There is nothing else going on. It's completely quiet around me, except for the cars in the background on the busy street that I happen to live on. Now, part of what made me say that in the first place was listening to the last part of my recording from the previous day, from yesterday. And I got myself into the frame of thinking, how am I going to possibly understand what it might mean for there to be a creator of all that there is? My mind rushes through almost like a battered child, the 20th century, the 19th century, and the changes in our sort of collective understanding of things, and our cultural, societal shifts, and how it continues to change and continues to shift. How I long for this state of stability, collective stability. And of course, at that point, I wonder if I'm thinking about things too much. There's only so much that I can do about things that seemingly are outside of my control. And yet at the same time, this little darkened man that finds himself within me, he is a part of a much larger entity, it would seem. At least it feels that way. And with all of this change, with all of our discontinuity in the modern era, on top of the individual dilemmas and issues that we all face, it's a lot. But then again, it always has been a lot, and my mind keeps circling through this thing about this age is different. We've never had this situation before. This and that, and then I come around to every age, I'm sure, has thought of that before, as cultures have risen and fallen, have grown into maturity, and have sunken into their own selfishness and pride and fallen into despair, obsolescence maybe. But then again, here we are. We are left at that moment, the moment that we all seemingly cherish, and the moment that seems to be far from us. The moment that I wish I could bottle and save forever, that I could feel continually. The moment when the melancholy begins to fade, the general anxiety of problems not solved diminishes like clouds that part in the sky, or as the sun sets in late summer, as it does now, and it leaves this yellow hue across the trees and the buildings, out of which I can see through my window. And there is this bittersweetness about it, about that experience, and how heavenly this brief moment may feel. Now at this time it happens that the sun has set. But it is a beautiful day, and my mind is in a particular state. And I can't help but feeling for man at this moment. I can't help but feeling for other people, other kindred spirits that may be out there looking out their windows or looking up at the sky and wondering why they're here, wondering if they were born for a reason, if there is something out there that understands that they exist. It's such a statement. A God that formed all things. It weighs heavy on the millennial's heart, on the contrarian's heart. I think we can say safely at this point that the millennials are brought up in this sea of contrarianism, a degree of cynicism. We like to deconstruct things, to take things apart, to look at their merits, if we could pay attention long enough. But there are downsides to it. Picking apart such a statement, the great God that formed all things, to examine the potential that the statement is false. It takes a toll on the mind, whereas if there was a mind that just did not necessarily need to worry about the contraries, or being so deliberate about justifying their claims or having reason to support their beliefs and perhaps their existence, life would seem much more straightforward. But this God that formed all things, I want to return to the idea of forming something. Now, there are plenty of ways, I think, in which one can discuss what a form is. We can think about Plato and Aristotle here, in terms of that formal realm. We could also think about form in terms of the creative element, the creative principle. There is some relationship, of course, between the two. The formal domain would have to be under the umbrella of that which is created. But that formal domain is inherently a creative sphere. It is where the mind of man plays to come up with his plans, to execute his designs for certain ends. And this, of course, is afforded to us by the mind that we inhabit, the mind that we imagine to be in some way similar to the mind that has been participating in this formal playground from day one, from its conception. Now, one of the reasons that comes to mind, for which I have attributed a strong reason for there being something that is responsible for all of intelligible reality, is, in part, because of our experience. Of course, in Genesis, there is that characterization, the distinction, the declarative that man is made in the image of God. And I come back to this formal playground for which the mind, at its best, stabilizes itself, focuses itself, and finds productive ends to fulfill its experiences. But the very existence of that thing for which we play in our sandbox for it to come from nothingness is such a strange proposition. For nothingness is the absence of being, it is the absence of intelligibility. And of course we can say that, well, what about the thing that is responsible for intelligibility? Where did that come from? Of course it didn't come from anywhere. It was always there. It was always something. Always something responsible. Always something identifiable. I think I get into the habit, as much as I see the singular word in front of me, God, this capital G-O-D, that it seems so neat and uniform, singular, in the context of the written word. But as I think about it in my mind, I realize that words limit the character, limits the idea, limits the possibility. So I'd like to move on to talking about what it would necessarily mean for some intelligible being out there, perhaps a part of all things, but has some singular identity somehow. How this thing moves down into its creation and purposefully sends that force, I'll call it the force of purpose, such that, given the normal interactions of things, let's say, just for example, myself, as I wake up every day and I go to work, I do the same routine for the most part. There's this general understanding of what one comes to expect living my life day in and day out. But there can be situations in which there would be such a disruption to my experience, to my day, that it would cause me to rethink some things. Now, an accident, I suppose if it's bad enough, may cause that sort of thing, but an accident, just as an example, I'm not sure would be sufficient enough. Now, if I saw an accident, surely not. It would provide some level of disruption, but it would not reach that threshold. The question then being, well, what event would cause or reach some threshold for which I would have one of these maybe divine experiences? Events of man are difficult to determine exactly. I suppose that there may be an event that's large enough that would cause me to have an existential experience, even if it was entirely man-made. And my mind goes to war. If war had come to the Midwest and things really changed, society became unstable, I think that then I would really have to question things, question my day-to-day, question my security, question that which I have come accustomed to and comfortable with. For that sort of situation would be completely out of the ordinary. The normal goings-on and interrelatedness of the various elements of our complex social system. Now, I live outside of Chicago, so there's a lot here. There's a lot going on in this major metropolitan area. And given a major disruption, societal disruption, there would be a lot of elements that at one time articulated with one another that would now seemingly be disarticulated. And there would be this period of reorientation. I sort of imagine the situation in which a nerve has been disrupted and its signal cannot flow. And now, during the healing process, it must reinnervate and reorganize itself to begin to pass information and transmit information. Now, I don't wish to suggest that God's intervention in something would be akin to a disruption, but it would have an effect, I think, that would be similar on the mind, in the sense that it would be a bit jarring. It would take time for the mind to reintegrate into the new world that it now is a part of. For surely a divine intervention would cause a major shift, a major change in the way that a person interfaces with reality, with things. And now a reward that comes from some place that we cannot logically attribute to another person or even a system would stimulate such a contemplative experience. But going back to my former analogy, that of war or societal disruption, I wonder what within this example would provide me with the characteristics that within that experience I would really change as a person. Now, of course, this pattern is on a lower level than the divine pattern, but still, it's an elevated pattern because it's a collective agent that is acting on singular agents. That it's an injury up at that level that transmits that information all the way down to us. I would have to imagine that at the very least I would begin to start thinking about things a little bit in a broader context, in a larger context, rather than my own individual experience, I'd be thinking about large global factors. Not literally global, but global in the sense that there are processes within the agentic arena that are much beyond the individuals, much beyond myself, but much beyond myself and the way that I participate within others around me. It is this scale of participation up until the point that I understand that this disruption had been caused or had been created. I think it would be something akin to a very rapid education in pattern recognition. And since it would be the case in this domain, I have to imagine that if that scaled up into an agentic arena, into that aspect of the agentic arena that is beyond just the United States, or some regional conflict within the United States like a civil war, that perhaps if aliens visited us, or if we were faced with an asteroid that was coming to hit the planet, again, the mind would be shifted immediately to focus on something that's not just a hypothetical. Forced to consider that pattern and how that would bleed down to us. In this situation, man seems to be, despite his technological advances, still so adolescent. I can imagine a situation in which man is into space and he has his spacefaring ships that provide him with artificial gravity and sufficient radiation protection. And there's this vast civilization of man that exists out there in the solar system. And at that level, I can imagine that there can be another war, a war of the solar system. At the stage that man must leave this planet because it is no longer habitable. When we are on our ships and our technology is sufficiently advanced that we can give ourselves energy off of very little matter, perhaps tapping into aspects of reality that we never knew possible. There will always be these types of dilemmas for which the arena seems to be larger and larger, assuming that man's experience doesn't get stamped out completely. And there are people that speak of the heat death of the universe. I'm a bit skeptical. Not that the universe won't end, but that consciousness will. Now, if we keep on going in this manner, at what point does man find himself face to face in that arena with something that is so much greater than him or beyond him? See, this line of thinking I don't think is correct. We run into an interface issue here. I don't think it really depends on the scale of human civilization or society. The divine impulse can happen at any time, anywhere, though we wish it would happen more frequently so we could just believe easily, readily, that there would be no question to it. But I'll have to say at this moment that we have explored before this issue of interface difference, that the interface of man with the physical substructure that he relates himself to is probably much different than an agent that exceeds his consciousness, or that exceeds his experience. If we scale it all the way up to the being that was responsible for all things, then the interface of that thing would necessarily be much larger than the human being. For the human being is something that is within the playground of that thing. And that what the agent, the human being, sees within his little sandbox as he plays with his toys and his tools, and he gets upset with his friends, and perhaps he sins, and perhaps he transgresses. Perhaps he just wonderful things, beautiful things, things that improve the conditions of the sandbox. The creator of that sandbox is known by his creation, by the agents that play within it. If the creator of that sandbox were suddenly to come back while the agents were playing within that sandbox, I'm not sure that they would know of it. They wouldn't be able to perceive of him, of his existence. It does not have a form that is similar to man's physical form. But they would be able to identify changes to the sandbox, changes to the formal structure of the sandbox, also changes to the way in which he interfaces with the sandbox. Since he is an agent that is made in the image of that thing, there are certain characteristics for which man has in common with that creator that allows him to understand what actions or what behaviors seem familiar to him as opposed to something else in his environment. And I'm thinking about my cat, for example. An agent that might be considered lower on that scale of consciousness and of awareness. Perhaps even there too, there would be something that would be so sufficient that would cause a change in their behavior to adjust it in such a way that their experience with the world that they had known is now changed. Not that they would suddenly become conscious like man is conscious, but they would participate with their world differently. And much like within our sandbox, if we were to find suddenly a massive new landscape for which we could explore, or a way of understanding how to put components of that landscape together to improve our experience, see, I seem to be missing the point here. For all of this sort of thing that I've mentioned is a part of the agent's ability and experience, but what we are asked to consider here is how it is possible that a reward can come. Now, it's possible that we could talk about divine intervention, but we can also talk about built-in rewards to the system. That it's just a matter of, as I've sort of alluded to, that it's a matter of man's experience to utilize what he has within the sandbox and play with and within the boundaries, the rules of that sandbox, in order to modify or to improve his condition. Of course, in that way, we would imagine that he can find himself into a reward, and anybody can find it, regardless whether or not they are said to be foolish or a transgressor. And so, what's probably meant in this verse is that sort of avenue or path. The other avenue or path would be the direct intervention. The possibility that somebody like Christ could come down to the world and have this divine spark, divine impulse, and relate to man on that level. But also I would imagine that despite the physical rewards that man can find within his physics, his chemistry, his political organization, I think within his behavior, within his experience, within his control of the processes of mind, he can find a broader, a more fulfilling experience, more fulfilling sense of being. And this would also be a reward, in a way. But again, something that is found, that which is already there. So going with that line, the great God that formed all things both rewards the fool and rewards the transgressors. We've spoken much of what the fool is, a person that is almost unable to focus their attention and to identify patterns in such a way that would cause them to rise above their condition, improve themselves. The foolish person is somebody that is always tripping over their own weaknesses. The transgressor is one that fails to identify or identifies but doesn't take heed, crosses a boundary between one thing and the next, expecting that they can maintain their relationship with things the way that they had before that they had crossed the boundary. Transgression is always something that has a negative context to it. That if I, for example, transgress, perhaps I say something to a friend that I ought not to have, my transgression, the boundary that I had crossed, will set into motion certain consequences, much like if I had broken into a building and set off some motion detector or something. I've crossed a boundary, and my transgression will set off a series of events to notify the forces that be that something has occurred. Now one can step beyond all sorts of things and not necessarily have it be a bad thing. We may not understand exactly why or why not a boundary is in place. Sometimes we may not see the boundary, and yet we step past it, and there are consequences that come, but part of that is the learning experience. The thing for civilized man is that there are certain transgressions, there are certain boundaries for which his collective experience teaches him not to cross, because X, Y, and Z will happen. But there's something undeniable, I think, about what the possibility for transgressing, the possibility that this experience may bring somebody a greater understanding of things, and perhaps given a situation in which somebody understands quite well what the big picture is up until a certain point, going beyond that for the sake of understanding may have negative consequences. But it'll teach them something more about understanding. The act of actually transgressing may reward them in a sense that they Either they don't do that behavior again, or they understand exactly what about their experience is limited. And perhaps that may limit them in terms of behaving in that way again, but they may try the same ends, but by different means. And this doesn't necessarily have to be some psychopathic experience. There are plenty of situations, however small or large, that I think that we encounter daily, especially in social interactions, how complicated that experience is. That leads us down this path. And so although it's easy to consider the fool as the absolute fool, the ideal form of the fool, and the ideal form of the transgressor, the sinner, as the one that is rewarded by God, but we have to remember that this is a striated thing. It is a fractal thing, the Russian doll, for which there are dolls of similar character but of varying sizes. This, I think, occurs as much here as it does in that representation. So of the fool, there are various levels for which that foolish experience can exist, as we've already talked about, and likewise with the transgressor. And so those rewards, although they may be subtle, I think it is possible because of what we are afforded by virtue of our existence and of our will, of the sandbox that we play in. It is the fruit that is there, that is offered us by God. As a dog returns to his vomit, so a fool returns to his folly. So I've been thinking more and more lately about this fool, the fool in me and my foolish behavior. And I can't help but think about my working life, the working environment, the environment that for many people is the place where we try to put our best foot forward, where who we are at work or professionally is that aspect of ourselves that we not that we try to put on a play or play the part of a character, but we put on this energized version of ourselves, that the mind is full of rigor, that there is responsibilities that must be met, and we must hold ourselves accountable because other people depend on us. Of course, this depends on the occupation, but for the most part, any working environment, I think, will have some degree of this responsibility and of sacrifice. And I think it's a good thing to be involved in work and to be working often. For this situation, for in our working lives, I feel as though our foolish behavior, and perhaps this is a fault of mine for not seeing it or remedying it more in my personal life, but the foolish behavior, when it does prop its head up, whether it be laziness, pushing off of some responsibility to later, or to push it off to somebody else so that they have to deal with it. Again, thinking about the core of the foolish person, the type of person who lacks the ability to pay attention, to make and to recognize patterns within the environment, to make strong statements about relatedness, and just generally to organize their thoughts in some coherent manner. As I've been attending to this, I think more and more I'm beginning to recognize where this exists, and it seemingly exists in places where I'd never thought it to be. It's almost as if the Proverbs have given me a light for which I can shine on my own experience, and as I do it, it unveils this landscape. I like to use that term a lot. But beneath that light, there is the scurrying dark objects of the fool that has ingrained himself within me. And as the light shines, the figures begin to dissipate and retract back into something that is a more manageable and responsible character. Of course, I'm nowhere near perfect, and I'm just really beginning to explore the aspects of my own foolishness. So, for example, today, this is a general example, an overall assessment, I think, of how technically today's the first day of the week, even though it's Tuesday. Labor Day was yesterday. Of how my mind processes information, especially on the first day of the week, when they ought to be fresh, but also when the mind isn't necessarily warmed up to the week just yet. And sometimes the pace of the schedule can catch me off guard, and I can sort of lag behind cognitively, attentively, and that could impact people downstream as time goes on. And I recognize this about myself. I recognize that this happens when I'm tired, when I'm fatigued. It happens when there's something that I don't understand, and within my misunderstanding or lack of understanding, there's this sense of anxiety, this anxiety that comes from a sense of personal insecurity, which is, I think, another aspect of foolishness, because the insecurity in one's own identity is the inability to properly identify the pillars of that identity. Identifying the pillars of that identity will allow one to be stable, a stable personality. And as I mentioned, the fool creeps into this space and disrupts the ability to recognize these strong, principled pillars of self-identity. And for my part, there are times that I can correct this quite well, and there are other times that it sticks with me, that in the moment I cannot correct it, and that, much like a parasite or a poison, it latches onto me, and it begins to infect future decisions and future conversations. And it's something that I know that I need to work on. I need to improve it. When it happens, the interesting thing about the immediate, or being in the experience, is that, at least in my experience, there are so many emotions that I have to corral and to control, so I can orient my attention, so I can pay attention to the point of the shared experience. But in the moments where I am confronted by something that would tempt me away from that point of attention. It's painful. I think it's painful to the mind. It must bear the feelings, almost like my body is being burned at the stake. I must endure the experience. Let the flames pass or continue to consume me until I understand that nothing valuable is being lost as long as I pay attention, as long as I weather the storm and continue being faithful, then my attention will not be disrupted. Now, there are other times where I am not as forthcoming, perhaps, not as diligent, not as faithful. In these situations, I think, bring us to this verse. As a dog returns to his vomit, so a fool returns to his folly. So in the first example, perhaps the explanation here may be just stating the obvious, but just from my own understanding and consolidation, when I think of a dog that returns to his vomit, I think of a dog that's, there's a few different situations. Now, a dog is an interesting animal, surely a beloved animal by man, but they have some bizarre behaviors. Whether it be vomit or feces, even a well-fed dog, I think, may consume this material. Now, this material is not going to be good to reconsume. And I think what, at the base is what I'm after here, the principle, the important thing, the important takeaway is the vile aspects of our behavior, of our experience, and of our existence. If we expel them, let's say, expel may not be the right word, it's correct in a sense, and in the sense that I mean that when I think of my own behavior, there are things that I can readily identify that I know that I have to change. And of these things, I know that I'll return back to them. I know that I'll revert to some behavior where when I know that I had committed it in the first instance, my behavior was just sort of out. It was expelled from me, in a sense. The event had occurred. Now it's just this moment in time stuck in my memory. I know that there are times for which, and there are behaviors that I understand are bad, that I should not continue to participate, or that there is something that I should have done, but I did not do it. Same sort of variation there. In these situations, inevitably, there will be something that I will return to of a similar pattern, perhaps something the exact same item that I may push off to the future, even though I know that I should finish it at that moment. Now, my mind is just going through different things. It's interesting. Now, when I return to this vomit, the behavior that I know is bad, I recognize as bad, I demonstrate this foolish behavior because, coming around again, I return to the vomit to consume it, to behave again in that way that caused me maybe pain, the negative sense of pain, that type of pain that comes from the destruction of the security of the self, the disruption of one's attention. When I return to the substance, when I return to the metaphorical substance, I know that my participation in that experience is going to be harmful for me. For what I had expelled in the first place, I expelled in a way that I had not learned from it. And rather than, much like the dog that sees the vomit as food or nourishment to return to instead of waste that is to be discarded, I, in my own foolish ways, come back to and return to behaviors that should have been expelled for reasons of waste, committed to memory and then learned from those situations, rather than return to it because I remember some pleasure. Maybe it's a short-term thing, or again, it could be some lacking in responsibility for which pushing off of an item may feel more satisfactory than to undergo the stress or or to contribute the mental faculties to something to square it away and to resolve an issue. So the question in my mind becomes, is there a constant or some principle that I can come to in my mind that, despite any particular example, will spread across almost all examples or situations, for which I can depend on and I can turn to in the event that I feel as though my faith is lacking, in the sense that my foolish behavior creeps in and I continue to contribute to inattentiveness. I suppose at some level it involves the will. Now, the will is something that I've talked about before on this podcast. It's a hard thing, I think, to narrow down, especially if one is trying to draw it from scratch. But it involves the soul. It involves our personal decisions. It involves the honest relationship that we have to ourselves. The commitment that we have to ourselves. And almost seemingly like the scientific enterprise for which we must commit ourselves to truth and this insatiable curiosity to know that which is true. Likewise, I think faith within the domain of personal experience also has the similar characteristic. That we have to at best always be aware of where our mind is in this intelligible domain, so that it is not corrupted. We have to be strong individuals, have a strong sense of self, have a strong sense of one's own identity, be firm in one's convictions. Now, this may or may not be seen as a principle. It would seem that no matter what, there's always going to be difficulty in the sacrifice between inattentiveness and that of attention, partly because the process by which we come to decide what to pay attention to involves a lot of mental energy and work. Those that have found something that occupies their time for which they are afforded the space for the mind to be free and to be consumed in that experience and be justified in it because they are after good ends. Those individuals should consider them the lucky few, I think. And I have to wonder if not this situation is meant to exist or is destined to exist within one's own individual autonomy. Not in totality, of course, because there has to be some relationship to another, but an over-dependence on systems, institutions. And this may be a thought that is particular to the contemporary age, but it would seem that many of our institutions these days do not afford us the type of autonomy that is necessary for the development of the individual, for the flourishing of the soul, and for good connections and between people and ourselves. So although I may not have necessarily come to some solid principle, I think at the bottom of it, it involves a strong personal decision, for which perhaps the initial moment of attention must be attending to that very basic fundamental, that we have to pay attention, that we have to fulfill our responsibilities. And it is possible for us to bring the soulful component into that experience, no matter how stifled we may feel. But it's a matter of will. It's a decision that we must make, that I must make. So I think I'm going to end this episode here, and I'll continue next time with verse 12 of chapter 26 of the Proverbs.